sounds so awesome. That intro music can only mean one thing, and that's another Air Raid edition. For those new to the show, an Air Raid edition is nothing more than additional content that's a bit of a departure from what we normally feature, but still related in some way, shape, or form. So sit back and enjoy. Okay, Ryan. So, one of the things that over the years where we've interviewed veterans that we've heard over and over and over again has to do with the USO. Many of these guys, when they talk about their experience during the war, and we mentioned this in our podcast before, they'll spend a lot of time talking about their journey from civilian life into boot camp and finally over into the theater, because back in the Great Depression, things like travel and air travel and boat travel were something that was relatively uncommon. So it really burned fresh in them. Well, being able to see famous movie stars, like Bob Hope and Laurel and Hardy and all that, was probably just as rare. So, mean, you and I have talked about this. Do you remember any specific instances or some of the things that some of these guys have talked about when you think back on what some of these guys have said about the USO?
Well, I mean, some of the things that stick out in my mind, probably above all else, is the kind of the hospitality girls that would be in these godforsaken locations around the world, serving up coffee and donuts. Yeah. And, I remember some guys being in the Pacific Theater and talking about coming back down to the beach. They've been in the island fighting and stuff. And there's some girls serving coffee and donuts. And they were blown away by that, But for a lot of the guys I've interviewed, not many of them got to see a USO show.
Yeah. And the ones who did remembered it very fondly.
Yeah. It was obviously something that, if you got one, it was a highlight for you. It was a big release for you, I guess, a little bit of a trip away from the battle zone for a little bit. But if you didn't get one, you were a little bitter, and you remembered that too. So.
And that's a great point, Ryan. People have mentioned the USO not just in what they saw, but griping that they weren't able to see that, especially the guys in the Pacific and they're in the forward areas. Yep. So it was really important. And just for a little background for our audience, because I didn't know this. I didn't even know what the heck the USO, what the initialism stood for, until I did a little research on this.
United States Organization,
right? I mean,
I have to admit, I was the same way. I mean, not having been in the military, I wasn't sure what USO stood for. I'm like, what is it? Is it part of the government? Is it part of the military? So.
And anyway. It turns out that it isn't. It stands for the United Service Organizations. And the USO, with the 3 stars on each side of the USO, is an emblem that I think most people have seen either in movies or at airports. Major airports have, there's over 200 centers worldwide for our vets to this day, but it was started in February 4th, 1941, shortly after Pearl Harbor was attacked. FDR wanted to provide, morale and, basically, he wanted them to have a home away from home. He wanted to provide entertainment to these troops. He wanted to keep their morale up. And it turned out, according to the things I've read from common sources, this request actually brought together 6 civilian organizations. They are the Salvation Army, the YMCA, the YWCA for the Young Women's Christian Organization, the National Catholic Community Service, National Travelers Aid Association, and the National Jewish Welfare Board. It turned out in World War I, these 6 organizations would provide entertainment separately. They weren't coordinated at all. So you had some people and some organizations going to some places and not others. So what FDR thought was, let's bring all of these together. Let's have a unified effort. And here is a division of labor according to that these private organizations, according to Roosevelt, would handle the on-leave recreation of the men in the armed forces. And according to historian Emily Yellen, he was quoted as saying that the government was to build the buildings, and the USO was to raise the private funds to carry out its main mission, which is boosting the morale of the military. So back then and to this day, the USO is a charitable organization, a 501c organization where you can donate money to the USO, and people have historically to help, and boost the morale of our troops. I thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah, and I guess what I just learned already is I didn't realize the USO wasn't around in World War One. I just assumed it's been
Yep.
around, at least since World War One. So to know that they actually gathered all these different entities together to make a more of a concerted effort to raise the morale and provide these services in support of the troops is new to me. So, well, uh, these sorts of things always are enlightening, especially at 9 o'clock in the morning for me
Yeah,
here. So,
exactly. It's so early. I've got my can of Monster. Ryan's got
yeah,
his cup of coffee.
yep,
And so yeah, I mean, basically, the whole idea behind the air raid edition is as we hear things that just continue to pop up over and over again, we just feel like we need to unpack them. And so I
yeah.
was surprised to learn that too. And so in World War II is when it became a thing. And spoiler alert, it's still a thing to this day.
Hmm.
But according to my research, during World War II, again, February 1942, that was just a few months after Pearl Harbor was attacked, it said within 5 months of being formed in February, so by, summer of 1942, very early in the War of the United States, 36 overseas units had been sent within the Americas, which makes sense because you had all these training centers. We had this mass mobilization. That's the first place that men would want aid and comfort. But they were also sent to the United Kingdom and Australia. And during 1942, the first year they existed, 1,000 people performed as part of 70 units. And here's something that I want to unpack a bit, Ryan. The average performers were paid $100 a week, but the top stars were paid less, only $10 a day. That's $70 a week because their wealth let them contribute more to their talents. What this reads is the more wealthy, well established stars basically got paid less because they had the means to support themselves on these tours in the ways that the um, less profile, the lesser known movie stars were. This really surprises me because this is completely the opposite of what we see today when there's these large events.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty progressive pay scale and structure that they've got set up, which is, I mean, I think when you look at it, I think it's meant to be a charitable organization.
Yes.
So I think this allows the actor or actress to and to be devoted to it also. I mean, otherwise if they're going to be prima donnas about it and say that, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to go on this USO tour unless
Yep.
I'm paid my rate.
Yep.
We don't want people like that. They don't want
We,
people like that.
we don't. And this is probably, I'm sure there are other ones out there, but this is probably the only large entertainment entity that draws top talent where the top talent doesn't say the things you just said, which is to demand some sort of significant compensation for their time. Even to this day, when we had the USO in for the Persian Gulf Wars, and we'll get into that in a little bit later about who was there, there was so much of that was supported by people giving their time freely. So
Yep.
so World War II, they established themselves really quick. I just wanted to read one quick thing that I think really enforces, maybe two quick things, Ryan. I'll hand it off to you that really reinforces how these movie stars felt. So here's one quote. Following the invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, a famous star, Edward G. Robinson, was the first movie star to travel to Normandy to entertain troops. He had already been active back home selling war bonds and donated $100,000 to the USO. And in 1942, that was no small amount.
Yeah,
And
that's a lot of
here's
money.
totally. And here's what he is quoted as saying, which really touched me a little bit. He said during his show, he said, quote, This is a famous movie star. Quote, "This is the most privileged moment of my life, the opportunity to be here with you." And the following month, camp shows began in Normandy. And then another one, Quentin Reynolds, who was a famous war correspondent, wrote an article for Billboard magazine in 1943, a year after, or a year before Normandy, that entertainment, this is his quote, entertainment, all phases of it, radio, pictures, live, should be treated as essential. You don't know what entertainment means to the guys who do the fighting until you've been up there with the men yourself. So I thought those two quotes from the research I did was really interesting in two ways. One, they saw it as an honor, as a highlight of their storied career.
Hmm.
These are very accomplished individuals. And secondly, they recognized the importance of it, especially when they went over there and saw it firsthand. I thought those were two cool quotes.
Yeah, and I think we'd all feel the same way. I mean, if to go from the insulated bubble of Hollywood even back then to get out and do something for good, especially after you've seen the big transformation that our country had gone through the previous few years, to be able to go from, also think about this. You had December 7th, 1941. Just a few months later, think of the whirlwind of activity happening in this country as of December 8th, 1941. And you go, all of these committees being formed. I mean, gosh, were there thousands of executive orders being executed then too? I mean, it's like, there had to be a flurry of activity going on to, like, oh, we need this, we need that, you need to handle this, you need to handle that. And to see the transformation of this country in industry, in culture, and to have, and you'd be an actor sitting there on the sidelines like, how can I help? I
Yeah.
mean, I make a movie or I can be a spokesperson, but this is their way to be able to help, give back. And I think I think they probably welcomed the opportunity to do it. I wonder if they had to turn people away or if they just made more shows, because I was reading that they had, in total, from the inception to now, over 400,000 USO shows have been done.
That's
Now
incredible.
that's all up to present day,
It was,
but
yeah.
there's no shortage of people wanting to get out there and show our appreciation and support.
And
So,
this was not easy duty, right? I
yeah,
mean, so
right.
from what I've read from this source, 28, this is just World War II, 28 performers died in the course
Uh,
of their tours from plane crashes, illnesses, diseases contracted while on tour. In one such instant, totally do like malaria and dengue fever and all this stuff. So here's one. In one such instance in 1943, a plane carrying a USO troop crashed outside Lisbon, killing singer and actress Tamara Drazen and severely injuring Broadway singer Jane Froman. Froman returned to Europe on crutches 2 years later after the accident to again entertain the troops. She married the co pilot who saved her life in that crash. And her
wow.
story was made into the 1952 film With a Song in My Heart. Unbelievable. So
Wow.
not only were these people who were very well known, whether actors, singers, comedians, some of them dying over there,
Well,
but there's these all these amazing stories, and the conditions that they performed in sometimes could be, I mean, unbelievably difficult.
well, so were you going to get to the big kahuna that died
Nope.
during World War II at the USO,
Why
well, on
don't
the
you talk
USO
about
tours?
that? Yep.
Well, just briefly, Glenn Miller,
Yep.
the huge star at the time. He had the Glenn Miller Orchestra, Moonlight Serenade, all of these songs that were just all over the radio back then. It was really the soundtrack of these GIs' lives, were Glenn Miller music and that sort of thing. Well, he had taken off, I believe it was in spring of '44 to go over to no, it had to be after that because he was going to France to do a show.
Mm.
And he took off from England in the middle of the night and was never seen or heard from again. And to this day, there's still an effort to try to figure out what happened to Glenn Miller. They think his plane likely went down not long after takeoff. It was stormy weather that night. But yeah, Glenn Miller, the world's, famous big band composer, died on a USO tour.
Yeah, Glenn Miller would have been like our modern day version of a Bruce Springsteen or a Taylor Swift back then. He
Yeah,
would have been, this is before rock and roll. This is before pop music. This is when big band was rock and roll and pop music. And he was at the very top of that. And he
yeah.
was over there entertaining our troops. And you're right. Out of the 28 people who died in a variety of ways, Glenn Miller was was probably the most high profile death associated with a USO volunteer during World War II.
Well, actually, I just thought of this. I think he was in the Army. I think he
Oh,
was in the Army at the time. So, I mean, he may have it. I think it was a USO event, but I'm not sure whether or not it was sanctioned, since
oh,
he's an Army guy.
I
Here you
got a little
go.
blurb on that. So, really quick, while the USO was ramping up, what I've read was while they were still trying to get, stars and singers and everything lined up to do these shows, they would pull people from the ranks who had talent. And a lot of the USO shows, especially the earlier ones, these camp troop sort of things that they did, were from servicemen who were in this special service battalion who could
Ah,
sing, who could dance, who could play music. And the USO, once they started getting various entertainers involved in this, actually used what these men, and I'll talk about women in a minute, did as kind of a model for what they would do forward. So servicemen played a pretty important role early on as well in entertaining the troops until the stars could make it there.
yeah. So it says here, I'm looking at the USO's own website here. They have so much information on their history and the statistics and everything. But it talks about how dangerous the USO tours were during World War II, and it says that the most famous entertainer who didn't make it back was legendary big band leader and then Army Major Glenn
Yeah.
Miller, whose plane disappeared over the English Channel on the way to France. So, there's been other people that were, obviously 37 entertainers, as Tony mentioned, were would die in this service, in this endeavor, and think that, we're talking about the ETO, but think about some of the places you got to travel in the Pacific. I mean, I know that, I, I think in a second here, we're going to start talking about the big kahuna of USO entertainers. And I'll save my story for that when we get there and everything. But
Okay.
there's some, pretty sketch stuff that they had to do to get to some of these locations that I would have been, I'm surprised there weren't more people that died.
Well,
So
here's
go ahead.
here's just talk about women entertainers. So here's a quote, and there's a whole series of women entertainers that include Marlene Dietrich, Judy Garland, Betty Grable, Rita Hayworth, right? We've heard of those people. And here's something that one of them wrote, quote, "We played to audiences, many of them ankle deep in mud, huddled under the ponchos in the pouring rain. It breaks your heart the first two or three times to see men so hungry for entertainment. We played on uncovered stages when we, as well as the audience, got rain soaked. We played with huge tropical bugs flying in our hair and faces. We played to audience of thousands of men, audiences spreading from our very feet to far up to the hillside in the middle of a jungle, and many sitting in trees to watch us. We played to audience in small units of 500 or so, and much oftener the audience of 8 to 10,000 every night we played a different place. So I thought that quote really touched on not just the difficulties that these entertainers face, the hardships they face, but the desire for these men to get a piece back home. And there's one more thing I want to add. One more thing I want to add. One of these performers, she was an opera singer, Lily Pons. She performed what she called a serious opera song, right? So this is something that a lot of guys would not have heard of. This would have been some hoity-toity, like New York sort of opera Broadway stuff. She was that level of an opera star, but she decided instead of just, singing, popular songs, she was going to sing operatically to them. And she did it to troops in Burma. And she wrote, an applause erupted that stunned even the most seasoned performers. She later wrote in a letter, quote, every woman back home wears a halo now, and those who represent her had better keep theirs on too. Basically, what she was saying was, we're here entertaining the guys. They're starving for women. And if you're one of these women back home waiting for your man, you better be true to this person. That's what she meant by the halo line.
That's pretty Powerful. Wow, what a great quote.
It totally is. And so we're gonna just touch quickly on some of the performers who do. Is there anything else you want to talk about World War II before we go through Korea and Vietnam and get to Bob Hope?
No, well, I mean,
Okay.
I think one of the things I was going to mention, if we do have time, is just a lot of the different kind of factoids about the USO. There's like, and I'll just run through this. This is on their website, but it's interesting stuff. 13 things you didn't know about the USO. The clubs were all over the place. There were 3,000 clubs. Some of them were in barns. Some of them were in people's homes.
Yeah.
I mean, they were all over the place. They were in railroad cars. They were mobile. I mean, they were in churches. It's amazing. They at a lot of these places back then, boxing was a huge sport,
Yep.
and they had a lot of boxing matches at
Yes.
these USO clubs. So Tony, you would have fit in great there.
That,
You
my,
know?
my nose is bent for anyone looking. I'm an ex-boxer. I've been in some scraps. My nose has been broken twice. I think I would have fit in. Probably would have got my ass kicked by these badasses, but
Oh, I see. I think I see your nose is bent
oh,
there.
dude, it
Okay.
is totally,
Can
absolutely bent.
can
Oh
you
yeah.
smell? Can you smell your left ear?
No, but I snore. I snore like a freight train. I'll tell you that much.
Oh, okay. Okay. So anyway, I'll keep going here. They had celebrity waiters. They sold cigarettes to troops, but they didn't sell liquor. Um,
Ooh,
and yeah, let's see what else. They had a woman in charge at every place, like a senior hostess at these places. The junior hostesses were the most famous feature, they say, of the USO because they were probably pretty cute little girls running
yep,
around,
yep,
and they were not allowed to wear slacks.
yeah.
They were wearing probably, I think, skirts. I think I'm looking at a picture. It looks like they were wearing
Hmm.
skirts. Um, anyway, so that's really they're the world's largest producer of banana splits. Apparently, that was like the big thing that they were
It
known
still
for.
is.
Yeah, so um, it says that the center, went through nearly a ton of bananas and 250 gallons of ice cream a day at the height of its operation in Honolulu.
And these were off men living off K rations, C rations.
Oh my God.
This would have been like, oh, I don't even know if I can. We're so spoiled now with the food available to us. I'm not even sure if I could come up with an analog for what it would have meant to get a banana split or a donut. And on
One,
top of that, oh, go ahead, Ryan.
no, no, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just had one last thing whenever you're finished.
Oh, so I just want to touch on the women one more thing. From
Yeah.
my research, it turns out that there's I think I looked at the women in the USO as the men looking at them as kind of like maybe a young guy would look at going to a strip show. Not that these women were strippers. No, no, not that these women were strippers, but these women were very attractive women. They were in a place where there weren't a lot of women. The men would have wanted to see that. But what I've read really surprised me in a positive way. A lot of these men, when they talked about the USO after the war, they talked about the women as being a surrogate or a reminder of the women back home that they wanted to come to. That they didn't
Yeah.
just go there like a bunch of horn dogs. Don't get me wrong. There was probably some cat calling. It's like, oh man, I don't
There,
care.
there, but there were services available for that off the base.
Yeah, there was. Totally, totally. It would be naive to think there weren't. But what
Right.
I thought was really cool is that for most men, when they talked about these shows after the war, they said that it made them feel, it reminded them what they were fighting for. It reminded them of their moms or their girlfriends back home. It reminded them of what they had to come home to. That was the message of hope of seeing these beautiful young women.
Yeah.
I
I mean,
thought that was cool.
I would think that would be what the image they would strive for also, which is, hey, let's remind these guys of what they can come home to.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And you want a good, wholesome, nice girl next door type,
Yep.
and everything. So the last thing I was going to say, as far as these little factoids and everything, they actually helped start the modern child care industry. This is something that I didn't realize, but a lot of women were working in the war effort back then, and they had kids. A lot of them had kids at home. So what do you think that they did back then for child care? Well, the USO actually provided child care for women as they went to work at the factories. And I think that is huge. And it probably, contributed in a large way to, I don't know if this is the right word, but the emancipation of the working woman wanting to be able to get a career for herself.
Yeah.
I mean, lots of women like having time away from home so they can clear their heads a bit because, taking care of kids, especially back then, you might have had a lot of kids.
Yeah.
That's quite a bit of stress in your life. And for you to have to do that, hold down the fort while your husband's gone, was a big deal. So that's all I wanted to say. I mean, they've really contributed a lot to our society.
I agree on the home front and on the front lines. And so it was kind of a surprise to me then that I read that 1947, a few years after the war, it was disbanded due to lack of funds, and that makes sense.
Sure.
Just peacetime, it's there's no need to fund a USO show if you're not going to have one. But then in 1951, the Korean War happened, and they fired it back up again. And from that point on, from 1950 till this day, as we sit here recording this, the USO has always been an entity because there's either been wars or other elements like you just mentioned, even to this day, right? Even if women aren't in factories, there are still women on bases or other places who need childcare and other types of support.
Sure.
And so the USO has expanded its reach and exists to this day. And there was, it was the same sort of thing as World War II. They went to some very treacherous conditions. By the end of the war, just as the Korean War, which just lasted 2 or 3 years, over 113,000 American USO volunteers were working at 295 centers abroad. So the Korean War is often considered the forgotten war, but the USO didn't forget our troops at all, and they were there in force. And then, unfortunately, wouldn't be much time of peace before we were in the Vietnam War. And what I learned about that is that the USO was in Vietnam before the first combat troops arrived. They were there first. The first USO club opened in Saigon in 1963. Isn't that a yes? Stunned silence from my co-host Ryan Fairfield.
I'm trying to comport like who were they supporting when they okay. Well, interesting. I didn't know that.
I thought it was interesting. I think we can, speak to what that may have meant in terms of how much certain leaders knew about what our involvement would be, maybe a form of foreshadowing. But at any rate, they had 23 centers in Vietnam and Thailand. And I'm just going to read a list of some of the people who performed there because these are relatively newer stars. People might recognize these a little more than the World War II ones. So some of the people that people may recognize who were heavy supporters of the USO and performed over there were John Wayne, Anne Margaret, Sammy Davis Jr., Raymond Burr, Phyllis Diller, Martha Ray, Joey Heatherton, Wayne Newton, Jane Mansfield, Red Fox, Rosie Greer, Nancy Sinatra, Jimmy Hawkins, Jimmy Boyd, George Papard, and Bob Hope, which we're going to talk about.
Who's that guy?
Exactly. They had Anne Margaret there during the Korean War, because I just touched on this briefly. Marilyn Monroe was someone who was actively involved in this. Debbie Reynolds, Bob Hope, Errol Flynn. So when we talk about these people coming in who are well known, we're talking about A-list celebrities who did some amazing things. And for those who maybe want to understand a bit more about some of the stars who showed up during the most recent war we were in, the Gulf War, you had people like Robin Williams, Craig Ferguson, Gary Sinise, Zach Brown. Oh, Ryan, I love this one. Five Finger Death Punch. Yeah. It goes on and on and on. Nick DePaul, Jim Florentine. Let's see here. Jessica Simpson, Avenged Sevenfold, Carrie Underwood, Drowning Pool, Toby Keith. I mean, it goes on and on. I would bore our audience, but the bottom line is these are people that people would have listened to. And I want to add one more thing before we go to the figurehead of all of this, which is Bob Hope. Is Anne Margaret, beautiful Anne Margaret. All the troops we talked about mention Anne Margaret. She visited a variety of theaters. A really interesting story I have on her, just really quick. She was at a book publishing event or a book signing event, and the book publishing representative for the event told her not to sign anything but the books. You're there for the book, sign the books. Well, what happened was it turned out that a veteran While she was performing in Vietnam, a veteran approached her and asked her to sign a photo he took of her while she is performing at Vietnam. And here's what she wrote. She took one look at the photo, tears welled up in her eyes, and she said, quote, "This is one of my gentlemen from Vietnam, and I most certainly will sign this photo," right in front of the guy who told her not to. I know what these men did for their country, and I always have time for what she called my gentleman. Amen to Anne Margaret.
Wow. Um,
Well,
you brought up Gary Sinise, and that's a whole nother, he's the new Bob Hope, to be honest with you.
he is. I agree.
And, I feel like, he has the Gary Sinise Foundation. He's his own entity, but doing as much good, I think, as the USO did, in a large way, throughout history. Not to the same scale, of course, but still, nonetheless, out there performing for the troops with his Lieutenant Dan band that he's in, you know. It's just it's so cool. I love to get Gary Sinise on our podcast sometime to talk to him about, oh gosh, so much stuff.
So much stuff, dude.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, so go ahead, Tony.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I think that's a great segue. This is our last segment. We'll wrap this up for our audience. Is that Bob Hope, how big of a deal was he? And I'm going to have Ryan go through some of the things that he's read. I'm just going to lead it off by reading this. In 1997, the U.S. Congress honored Bob Hope by declaring him the quote first and only honorary veteran of the U.S. Armed Forces. This man has ships and planes named after him.
That's true.
I mean, think about this, where he is the first and only. He's the only civilian who was in 1997 was given the honorary title as a veteran of the armed forces, a war veteran, and he would totally deserve that.
Well, yeah. I mean, he went into a lot of these hot places where there was active fighting going on, traveling to the most horrible corners of the world, like the Pacific Theater, with all these islands where you had, as we mentioned earlier, when you were reading one of the accounts of one of the performers, where you had, dysentery and malaria, and you had huge tropical bugs, and you had 114-degree heat, and,
Yeah.
All different types of animals and treachery and, enemy around.
Right.
I mean, there was one story that I was going to read that I had read somewhere. I don't actually have it in front of me, but I read it somewhere in my in the past, where Bob Hope was traveling into some Pacific island. I forget which one it was. It might have been like Bella La Vella or something like that. And they were in a little Stinson L5. Okay,
Yeah.
Tony, we've flown in one of those
Yeah.
before.
They're canvas covered steel cage death
They're artillery
boxes.
spotters. I
Yes.
mean, and I don't know how. I mean, but they had to be ferried in. They had one seat in the back, and then the pilot rode in the front, or vice versa. I can't remember which one it was. And they had to be ferried in, from the other island nearby, which was probably 40, 50 miles away. And I can't, when we were flying in that one, we flew in Amarillo over the Paladero Canyon.
Yep.
I was puckering up, as it was being over land. I can't imagine being on the Pacific Ocean where you've got, submarines and stuff like that, But anyway, the stuff that these guys did, Bob Hope did over 400 USO shows himself that he conducted just in World War II.
And
So I
he
think,
would perform shows all the way through 1991
yeah,
with Desert Storm. And you just talked about the danger. There's a couple things I just want to add because it's a perfect time to squeeze this in. Is the enemy knew that Bob Hope was a morale booster. And here's just a couple of quotes from that. Here's from war correspondent Quentin Reynolds, wrote 1943, quote, "He and his troop would do 300 miles in a Jeep and give 4 shows. One of the generals said Hope was a first-rate military target since he was worth a division. Presumably, the Nazis appreciated Hope's value since they thrice bombed towns while the comic was there. And in Vietnam, it is written that soon after a Christmas show in Saigon, 1967, he learned, Bob Hope, that the Viet Cong had planned to launch an attack at the Hotel Hope's troop that he was staying at, and the attack missed Bob Hope by 10 minutes.
Wow, I
So
didn't know that was that
they
close.
were actually targeting Bob Hope. He was seen as that much
Oh yeah.
of a force multiplier that the Nazis in the Viet Cong were trying to kill him.
First of all, I didn't realize Bob Hope had entertained in Europe. I thought he had only been in Pacific, but that was just my lack of knowledge. So that's pretty interesting. And the fact that I thought you were going to say that they recognized he was a big power player, so they were all trying to watch too, or something. That wasn't it at all. So,
But think about
no,
think
yeah.
about the morale. Remember when was it Ernie Pyle who the famous war correspondent who died? I think it was
Oh,
on
and I,
Okinawa. Or
yeah,
either
just off Aishima was the little island just off of Okinawa that he died at.
And remember the effect that that had on the men. Remember when FDR
Oh,
died and people we've interviewed talked about how demoralizing that was. Think about Bob Hope dying. I mean, there's a reason why
oh,
they targeted men like this is because they had an outsized influence on people's thinking.
yeah. Well,
I
that's
thought that
true.
was
Yeah, he was an asset. He was definitely a war industry asset for us.
so. Just a couple of things that I have, and then anything that you want to have to wrap this up, Ryan. But the Bob Hope, right? I mean, over the years, he's had more honors. A C-17 Air Force plane was named the Spirit of Bob Hope. A naval vessel was named the United States Navy ship Bob Hope. Throughout streets and bases across the country, or naval bases, army bases across the country, there are streets, schools, hospitals, and a golf tournament named after him.
Yeah.
The Guinness Book of World Records has called him the most honored entertainer ever. I mean, that's the reach that this guy had. He's in the Guinness Book of World freaking Records. He has ships and planes, streets, schools, hospitals named after him. I remember as a young kid, I was born in 1970. I remembered Bob Hope as this kind of this old comedian guy. I didn't really have a full appreciation for who he was. But my mom and dad did. They would just sing his praises. And all I saw as a little kid, and you got to remember by the time I would have really remembered seeing Bob Hope, probably been 1980 when I was around 10. I just saw this old dude just kind of trundling out on the stage and kind of just being kind of campy
With the golf
with the
club, he'd
golf
always,
club.
yeah, yeah,
Exactly. And
yeah.
it turns out after interviewing these World War II vets and doing a research, not just on the USO and how magnificent an organization that is, but on Bob Hope in particular, it's like, well, no wonder my parents felt that way about him. A whole maybe two or three generations did. And now I do after doing some of this research.
Well, I mean, to cover that number of decades of service to your country, and he's probably the most, before I don't know. I mean, I was going to say he's probably one of the most widely recognized performers in the history of our planet.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I mean, right up there with Elvis,
Yep.
and the like. So, I have nothing but admiration and respect for Bob Hope as ever, but who am I? But I mean, other than a fan. So, the guy had so many jokes.
Yeah.
So many jokes. I read somewhere that every time Johnny Carson would have him on the Tonight Show, he would drive Johnny Carson nuts because he would never answer his questions. He'd just tell jokes the whole time.
And he was in movies, right? I watched a few movies that he's in. He's absolutely hilarious. His timing is awesome.
Yeah,
Anyway, we
yeah,
so
yeah.
so Ryan, do you have any other things that you wanted to share that we get a chance to touch on, or did we get some of the things that you had a
No,
chance
no.
to
I
look
mean,
through?
I think this is great. This has been a pretty interesting little vignette here that we've done just to kind of figure out, to dive into some subjects. These are some subjects that Tony and I have found are interesting to us that we wanted to kind of explore. So we've got more. If our listeners have anything that you'd like us to kind of touch on or dive into that would be of interest to you, reach out to us. Let us know. Email us. Post something on Facebook. Any of that kind of stuff, and we will do our best to do it justice. So,
Awesome. So
yeah.
with that, another Air Raid edition has been complete. We look forward to sharing more of we look forward to sharing more of these with our audience. We hope you find them enjoyable. They're a little different from what we normally do. And with that being said, I'm Tony Lupo.
I'm Ryan Fairfield. Thanks for listening.
Peace out, our Twinder homies. Talk to you later.